The judge thought it would be routine. Another young defendant, another quick plea, another case closed before lunch. But within the next few minutes, the quiet 19-year-old standing at the defense table would do something that hadn't happened in that courtroom in years. She would make the entire room fall silent, and she would force a judge to question everything he thought he understood about the case in front of him. But none of that was obvious when the morning began. The courthouse in Jackson County had already been busy for hours. Metal detectors beeped at the entrance. Attorneys rushed down hallways carrying folders. Defendants sat quietly on wooden benches, waiting for their names to be called. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere was exactly what you'd expect on a weekday morning. Routine, predictable. Judge Harold Whitaker had presided over this courtroom for almost 20 years. He had seen every type of case imaginable: fraud, theft, assault, drug charges. And after 2 decades on the bench, he believed he could read people quickly, especially young defendants. They usually fell into one of 2 categories: defiant or terrified. The girl standing quietly beside the public defender didn't seem to be either. Her name was listed on the docket as Elena Torres, 19 years old, charged with felony fraud. The allegation was simple. According to the prosecutor's report, Elena had used a fake identity to access a restricted financial database belonging to a private contracting firm. The company claimed she had attempted to retrieve internal records tied to several federal infrastructure projects. The prosecutors described it as corporate espionage, a serious charge. But the case file itself seemed thin. Still, Judge Whitaker wasn't interested in digging deeply this morning. Not yet. There were 40 cases on the docket. Efficiency mattered. Case 24, the clerk announced. Elena Torres. The young woman stepped forward. She wore simple clothes, no jewelry, no makeup, just a dark blazer that looked slightly too big for her shoulders. Her public defender leaned toward her and whispered something. She nodded calmly. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file. 19 years old, he muttered quietly. Then he looked up. Elena Torres, he said firmly. You've been charged with unauthorized access to a protected corporate system and attempted data extraction tied to federal contracts. The courtroom remained quiet. You understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was steady, not nervous, not emotional, just calm. The judge paused slightly. Most defendants her age stumbled when speaking in court, but Elena didn't. Your attorney has indicated you wish to speak before the court considers bail. The public defender glanced nervously at her. This wasn't his idea. Elena had insisted. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair. Very well, he said. You may speak. Most people expected a typical statement: apology, excuse, maybe a plea for leniency. Instead, Elena looked directly at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then briefly toward the gallery. And when she spoke again, the tone of her voice changed, not louder, but more deliberate. I would like to clarify something about the system I accessed. The prosecutor frowned immediately. That system, Elena continued calmly, was not properly restricted. The prosecutor stood halfway out of his chair. Your Honor? But the judge raised his hand. Let her finish. Elena continued. The database belonged to Helios Infrastructure Group. Several people in the courtroom shifted. The name was familiar. Helios was one of the largest private contractors working on federal construction and transportation projects across the country. Massive budgets, government partnerships, serious legal teams. The judge frowned slightly. Miss Torres, he said carefully, you are admitting to accessing their system? Elena didn't hesitate. Yes. The prosecutor immediately smiled, but Elena raised a single finger gently. But that isn't the real issue. The judge leaned forward. What do you mean? Elena took a slow breath. "What matters," she said quietly, "is what was inside that system." The prosecutor stood fully now. "Your Honor, the defendant is attempting to introduce irrelevant statements." But Elena spoke again, and when she did, her next sentence made the courtroom go completely silent. "There were federal audit flags inside the Helios database," she said. "Flags that were never reported." The judge's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation." "I know." The prosecutor stepped forward quickly. "This is outrageous speculation." But Elena didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. There were at least 12 infrastructure contracts with altered compliance reports. The prosecutor slammed his folder down. "Your Honor, I move that the court strike these statements immediately." But the judge didn't speak, because something about the way Elena was talking felt different. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't improvising. She sounded like someone describing something she had seen very clearly. "What kind of contracts?" the judge asked slowly. Elena answered without hesitation. "Transportation safety retrofits." The judge's expression changed slightly. "What agency?" Elena paused, and then she said something that made the prosecutor's face drain of color. "The Federal Oversight Division." A murmur moved through the courtroom, quiet but noticeable, because that agency had been appearing in headlines recently. Internal audits, investigations, contract reviews. Judge Whitaker leaned back, slowly. "You're telling this court," he said carefully, "that you accessed a contractor's database and discovered unreported federal audit flags tied to government infrastructure contracts." "Yes." "And instead of reporting this properly," the prosecutor snapped, "you illegally extracted information." Elena finally looked at him. "I didn't extract anything," the prosecutor scoffed. "That's not what the report says." Elena turned back to the judge. "The system logs will confirm that I triggered an alert." The judge blinked. "What kind of alert?" Elena answered quietly. "A compliance escalation." Now the courtroom was fully silent. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Because compliance escalations didn't go to contractors. They didn't even go to prosecutors. They went somewhere else. Judge Whitaker lowered his voice slightly. "Ms. Torres, who did the alert go to?" Elena held his gaze. Then she said 3 words that made the atmosphere in the courtroom shift instantly. "Federal Oversight Division." The prosecutor froze. And then Elena added something else, something no one in that courtroom had expected to hear. "They should be here soon." For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the courtroom doors opened. 2 people stepped inside. Dark suits, official badges, and the quiet confidence of people who didn't ask permission to enter a room. The clerk whispered something to the judge. Judge Whitaker looked down at the note, then back at Elena. Then toward the 2 individuals walking slowly toward the front of the courtroom. And suddenly, the case he thought would take 5 minutes was becoming something else entirely. But the most shocking moment hadn't happened yet, because what the judge was about to learn about Elena Torres would change the entire direction of the hearing, and raise a question no one in that courtroom had even considered. Why would a 19-year-old risk federal charges to access a contractor's database? Unless she already knew what she was looking for. And if she did, someone much bigger might be involved. But the truth about that would surface only minutes later. And when it did, even the judge would struggle to keep control of his own courtroom. The 2 individuals who entered the courtroom did not rush. They didn't look around nervously. They didn't ask permission. They simply walked down the center aisle with the quiet confidence of people who knew they belonged there. One of them carried a slim black folder. The other scanned the room once, calmly. By the time they reached the front row, the tension in the courtroom had thickened. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses again. "Bailiff," he said quietly, "identify the individuals entering the court." The bailiff stepped forward. A short exchange followed. Badges were shown, credentials examined. Then the bailiff turned toward the bench. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "they're with the Federal Oversight Division." A murmur spread through the gallery. Even the prosecutor's posture changed, because that agency rarely appeared in person unless something serious had already begun moving behind the scenes. The two agents approached the prosecution table. One of them spoke quietly. "Your Honor, we apologize for the interruption." Judge Whitaker folded his hands. "You're interrupting a felony hearing," he replied. "I assume there's a reason." The older of the two agents nodded. "There is." He turned slightly toward Elena, and for the first time since entering the room, he gave the smallest nod of recognition. It was subtle, but it didn't escape the judge. "What exactly is the purpose of your appearance?" Whitaker asked. The agent opened the folder. "Your Honor, earlier this morning our division received a Level 3 compliance escalation alert originating from the internal system of Helios Infrastructure Group." The prosecutor frowned. "That's irrelevant to this proceeding." The agent didn't look at him. Level 3 alerts are automatically flagged for immediate review when they involve federal infrastructure contracts exceeding $100 million. The courtroom quieted again. The judge leaned forward. "And this alert came from the defendant?" "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor stepped forward again. "This is absurd. The defendant illegally accessed a private corporate system." The agent finally turned toward him. "Counselor," he said calmly, "that system contained federally regulated compliance records." The prosecutor's mouth closed, because that changed the legal landscape instantly. Helios might be a private contractor, but once federal infrastructure money entered the system, oversight regulations followed. The judge slowly turned toward Elena again. "Miss Torres," he said, "you triggered the escalation yourself." "Yes, Your Honor." "How?" "I used their internal audit portal." The judge blinked. "You understood how to navigate their compliance architecture?" "Yes." The public defender, who had been silent until now, looked like he had just realized he might be the least informed person in the room. "Your Honor," he said cautiously, "my client is a computer science student." Elena glanced at him briefly, then looked back at the judge. The agent from the Oversight Division spoke again. "Our preliminary review confirms that several compliance records inside the Helios system had been modified." "Modified how?" the judge asked. "Safety certification timestamps were altered." The prosecutor shook his head. "This is still irrelevant. The defendant's actions remain illegal." But the second agent spoke for the first time. "Actually, that's not entirely accurate." Everyone looked at him. "Federal law allows whistleblower escalation if a contractor's reporting system contains falsified compliance data tied to federal projects." The prosecutor's confidence faltered. The judge leaned forward again. "And are you suggesting that's what happened here?" The agent turned slightly toward Elena. "We're still verifying." Then he opened the folder and placed a single document on the prosecution table. "However," he said calmly, "the database access logs confirm the escalation trigger originated from the defendant's session." The prosecutor looked at the document. His expression tightened, because the timestamp matched the exact moment listed in the arrest report. But something else was bothering the judge. He tapped his pen lightly on the bench. "Ms. Torres," he said slowly, "you are 19 years old." "Yes, Your Honor." "You accessed a contractor's internal compliance system." "Yes." "You navigated an audit portal most employees wouldn't even know existed." "Yes." The judge paused. Then he asked the question that had been building in his mind since she first spoke. "How did you know where to look?" For the first time since the hearing began, Elena hesitated, not out of fear, out of calculation, because answering that question would change everything. She looked briefly toward the two agents. They said nothing. Then she looked back at the judge. "I had seen something similar before." The judge narrowed his eyes. "Where?" Elena took a slow breath, and her answer sent another ripple through the room. 3 months ago? In Phoenix. One of the agents looked up sharply. The prosecutor blinked. Phoenix? The judge asked. Yes. What happened in Phoenix? Elena didn't explain, not fully. She simply said something that sounded almost like a passing reference. There was another contractor. The agent beside the aisle leaned toward his colleague and whispered something. The judge noticed. You're aware of that case? He asked them. The older agent answered carefully. There was an ongoing review. Of what? Federal bridge retrofitting contracts. The judge looked back at Elena. You're saying you saw the same pattern in another contractor's system? Yes. And that led you to Helios? Elena nodded once, but then she said something that made the oversight agents exchange another quick look. It wasn't just Helios. The judge's pen stopped moving. What do you mean? Elena's voice remained calm. There were other companies listed in the internal procurement cross-references. The prosecutor tried to regain control. This is speculation. But Elena didn't react. She simply added another quiet sentence. And the compliance edits followed the same pattern. The judge's gaze sharpened. What pattern? Elena answered immediately. Delayed safety verification updates. The oversight agent slowly closed his folder, because he understood exactly what that meant. If safety verifications were being altered, then infrastructure projects could have been approved before proper inspections were completed. Bridges, rail systems, highway retrofits, projects millions of people depended on. The judge leaned back again. Now the courtroom no longer felt like a simple fraud hearing. It felt like the beginning of something else. Agent, he said quietly, how large are Helios's current federal contracts? The agent answered without hesitation. Approximately $2.3 billion. The number hung in the air. Even the spectators in the back row shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor attempted one final push. Your Honor, regardless of these allegations, the defendant still committed unauthorized access. The judge looked down at the file, then at Elena, then at the oversight agents. And then he asked a question no one had expected. Agent, did Ms. Torres attempt to conceal her identity when triggering the escalation? The agent shook his head. No, Your Honor. Did she extract any financial data? No. Did she attempt to profit from the access? No. The judge closed the case file slowly. Then he looked at the prosecutor. You may have charged the wrong person. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no words came out. The judge turned toward the oversight agents again. Are you opening an investigation into Helios infrastructure? The older agent gave a careful answer. We are evaluating several contractors. Several? The agent nodded once. Then he said something that made the room feel even colder. This may not be isolated. The judge looked back at Elena. You realized that, didn't you? She nodded quietly. Yes. Why risk this? For the first time, a hint of emotion appeared in her expression, because the answer wasn't technical. It wasn't strategic. It was personal. My father worked on one of those projects. The courtroom waited. Elena's voice dropped slightly. The safety inspection report said the structure had passed. She paused, but the workers knew something wasn't right. The judge frowned. What happened? Elena answered with a calm that somehow made the moment heavier. There was an accident. No one spoke, because now the room understood why she had been looking at compliance records, why she knew where to search, why she had triggered the escalation. But the biggest revelation still hadn't surfaced yet, because what the oversight agents were about to confirm would turn this hearing into something far bigger than a contractor investigation. It would suggest that the compliance edits Elena discovered were connected to something much deeper, a network of contracts across multiple states and possibly multiple cities already under review, But the judge wouldn't learn the full scope of that until a single phone call interrupted the hearing minutes later. A call that would make even the federal agents in the room go quiet and force Judge Whitaker to realize that the quiet 19-year-old standing in front of him might have just uncovered the beginning of a national corruption investigation. And once that realization hit the courtroom, nothing about the case would remain routine again. The courtroom had already changed. What had started as a simple fraud hearing had quietly transformed into something much heavier. No one was whispering anymore. No one shuffled papers. Even the spectators in the back row seemed to understand that something unusual was unfolding. Judge Harold Whitaker looked down at the bench for a long moment, thinking. Then he looked back at Elena Torres, 19 years old, standing calmly beside a public defender who looked like he had walked into the wrong courtroom. Across the aisle, the prosecutor no longer looked confident. And near the front row, the two agents from the Federal Oversight Division stood silently, waiting. They had not taken control of the hearing, but their presence had changed the gravity of the room. Whitaker tapped his pen once. "Agent," he said slowly, looking toward the older of the two. "If these compliance records were altered, who would normally be responsible for submitting the original verification?" The agent answered carefully. "The contractor submits documentation, Your Honor, but the verification chain includes third-party inspection firms and federal reporting portals. And if timestamps were altered, that would require access inside the contractor's compliance system." Whitaker nodded. Then he asked the next question. "Would that type of edit leave a trace?" The agent paused. "Yes." The judge leaned forward. "Then I assume you're already looking for it." The agent gave a small, measured answer. "We are now." That sentence settled over the courtroom like a heavy curtain, because everyone understood what it meant. The investigation had already begun, but before the judge could speak again, the courtroom phone rang. The sharp sound cut through the silence. The clerk looked startled. Calls during hearings were extremely rare. Whitaker frowned. "Answer it." The clerk picked up the receiver, listened, then slowly covered the mouthpiece. "Your Honor, it's for the Federal Oversight Division." The agents looked at each other. The younger one stepped forward and took the phone. "Agent Miller." He listened. At first his expression didn't change. Then his eyes shifted slightly. "Understood," he said quietly. A few seconds passed. "Confirmed?" Another pause. Then he said one word. "Copy." He hung up slowly. The room waited. The judge spoke first. "Well?" Agent Miller looked toward his colleague, then toward the bench. "The escalation alert Ms. Torres triggered has already been reviewed by the regional compliance server." "And?" The agent hesitated for half a second, because the information had arrived faster than anyone expected. Then he said the words that shifted the courtroom again. "They found additional edits." The prosecutor leaned forward. "What kind of edits?" Miller looked down at the folder. "Not just Helios." The judge's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The agent answered carefully. "The same compliance modification pattern appears in 2 other contractors." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge raised his hand for silence. "Which contractors?" The agent read from the screen of a small device in his hand. "Atlas Structural Systems." Another pause. "And Meridian Transit Engineering." The judge exhaled slowly, because those weren't small companies. They were major infrastructure contractors, rail lines, bridge repairs, transit systems, billions in government work. The prosecutor spoke again, his voice much less certain now. "That still doesn't excuse illegal system access." But Judge Whitaker looked at him in a way that made it clear the conversation had moved beyond that argument, because the scale of what was emerging had already begun to dwarf the original charge. Whitaker turned to Elena. "You suspected this?" She nodded once. "Yes." "How many contractors did you believe were involved?" Elena answered quietly. "At least 4. The oversight agents exchanged another glance, because the phone call had only confirmed 3. Whitaker noticed the reaction immediately. "You see the problem," the judge said to the agents. The older one spoke carefully. "We see the possibility." Whitaker leaned back again. The courtroom clock ticked loudly on the wall. Then he asked Elena something that had been sitting quietly beneath everything else. "You said your father worked on one of these projects." "Yes." "What project?" Elena took a slow breath. "The I-47 bridge retrofit outside Phoenix." The younger agent looked up instantly, because that name had surfaced before. Whitaker noticed. "You recognize that project?" Agent Miller answered slowly. "There was a structural incident reported last winter." The judge's voice sharpened. "Incident?" Elena finished the sentence for him. "A collapse." No one spoke. The gallery remained perfectly still. Whitaker lowered his voice. "Your father was injured?" Elena shook her head. "He was there that morning." Another pause. "But the shift changed." The judge understood immediately. Someone else had taken that position. Someone else had been under the structure when the support beam failed. Whitaker closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, the entire case looked different. Not just legally, morally. He turned toward the prosecutor. "Counselor, I believe the charge against Ms. Torres may require reconsideration." The prosecutor looked trapped between legal procedure and a rapidly evolving federal situation. "Your Honor, But the judge raised his hand. "This court is not going to rush a ruling while federal compliance irregularities are being confirmed in real time." The prosecutor sat down slowly. Whitaker turned toward the oversight agents again. "How many cities are connected to these contracts?" Agent Miller answered carefully. "We're still mapping that. But there are at least 6 infrastructure projects tied to the same reporting network." "Which cities?" The agent paused. Then he said something that made the room even quieter. "Phoenix," another beat. "Denver." "And Chicago." The judge stared at the bench, because those were not small regional projects. Those were major federal corridors, transportation arteries, millions of commuters, thousands of workers. Whitaker looked back at Elena. "You realize this might be bigger?" "Yes." "And you triggered the escalation anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" Elena's answer came without hesitation. "Because someone needed to." The judge studied her for several seconds. There was no arrogance in her voice, no pride, just quiet certainty. Agent Miller closed his folder again. Then he spoke carefully to the bench. "Your Honor, we will need access to the system logs Ms. Torres triggered." Whitaker nodded. "You'll have the court's full cooperation." Then he looked toward Elena's public defender. "Counselor?" The man straightened nervously. "Yes, Your Honor." "I believe your client may now fall under federal whistleblower protection statutes pending further review." The courtroom shifted again, because that meant something important. The legal ground beneath the case had just flipped. Whitaker turned toward the clerk. "Release Ms. Torres on personal recognizance." The gavel struck once, but the judge wasn't finished. He looked toward the oversight agents. "Agent Miller." "Yes, Your Honor." "If this pattern spreads beyond 3 contractors," Miller finished the thought quietly, "then it becomes a national compliance investigation." Whitaker nodded. Then he looked at Elena one last time. "You understand something important, Ms. Torres." "What's that?" "You didn't just trigger an alert today." The judge paused. "You may have started something much larger than this courtroom." Elena didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, because she had already suspected that. Agent Miller turned to leave, but before reaching the aisle, he stopped. Then he said something quietly to his partner, not meant for the room. But the judge still heard it. "Add 3 more cities to the review list." Whitaker looked up. "3 more?" Miller nodded slightly. "We've seen the pattern before." The judge felt the weight of those words. Before. Meaning, this might not even be the beginning. Just another thread, another contractor, another quiet database, another hidden edit in a compliance system. And somewhere out there, someone high enough in the chain to allow it. The courtroom slowly emptied. The prosecutor packed his files. The agents stepped into the hallway. And Elena Torres walked out of the courtroom the same way she had walked in, quietly, calm, almost unnoticed. But long after she left, Judge Whitaker remained seated, looking down at the file, thinking about something Agent Miller had said. 6 projects, 3 cities, maybe more. And then he noticed one final detail on the compliance report. A name buried deep in the contractor registry. A holding company, one he had never seen before. Whitaker read it again, slowly. Orion Civic Holdings. He circled the name with his pen, because something about it didn't feel accidental. Not in a system this large, not across this many contracts, and certainly not across this many cities. The judge leaned back in his chair. The courtroom was empty now. But the silence felt different, because what had started as a routine case had quietly exposed the first crack in something much larger. A network that stretched across contractors, cities, and possibly far higher than anyone in that courtroom realized. And somewhere inside that network, someone would soon learn that a 19-year-old had triggered the alert, which meant the next move would not come from a courtroom. It would come from whoever had been hiding behind those edited compliance records, and they would not be happy that someone had started asking questions.